We have placed a link to the free symposium in the chat box for your convenience. We very much appreciate the support and encouragement for the symposium provided by Eric Hirschberg, Director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, and for the webinar by Carolina Jimenez, WOLA's new president. We also appreciate the technical support, necessary technical support, by Isabella Oliver at WOLA, Sergio Ovalle at the AU Center, and the editorial assistance provided by Valerie Valdez at AU. On July 11th, 2011, Cuba was rocked by demonstrations that occurred throughout the country. It had not experienced such widespread and intensely felt protests since the overthrow of Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship 62 years earlier. Unlike demonstrations in 2020 by artists and writers, the mid-July demonstrations did not occur only in Havana. To be sure, the artists and writers' objectives were important. They sought fewer restrictions on public expression and the release of a musician and an artist who had been jailed as enemy mercenaries. But their objectives were not the primary concerns of the vast majority of the populace. In contrast, the demands of the July protesters focused on a broad range of grievances, some of which had been festering for years. By 2018, when Miguel Diaz-Canel was elected as Cuba's new president, the country had experienced considerable change from the moment when Fidel Castro stepped down as president 12 years earlier. The number of small businesses had increased substantially. Greater freedom of expression contributed to an explosion of new films, music, art, literature, and commentary. International engagement, especially the opening to the United States in 2015, created several new opportunities for development. There was eased travel restrictions that enabled Cubans to work from abroad, work abroad, and to retain their property and rights on the island, and the internet was becoming widely available. However, the economy was stagnating. Poverty was on the rise, and inequality had increased. Consider that the Gini index, a measure of inequality, was 0.24 in 1986, an enviable number. But by 2017, it had risen to 0.45. The most significant economic reforms were still in their planning stages. Venezuela could no longer provide the same amount of low-priced oil, and Cuba's ability to generate sufficient hard currency from sources other than tourism and remittances had become problematic. 3 years later, by 2021, Cuba's problems had only deepened. Arch conservative governments in Brazil, Ecuador, and Bolivia ended programs involving Cuban medical personnel, which resulted in Cuba losing more than $500 million. In 2018 and 2019, economic growth was anemic. Then, in 2020, Cuba closed its doors to all foreign visitors in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Gross domestic product declined by 11% from the previous year. By taking preventive measures, Cuba did weather the pandemic quite well in 2020. But shortly after it opened again to foreign visitors in late December 2020, the cases of COVID-19 and deaths from the virus began to soar. Cuba quickly became the country with the worst COVID-19 rate in the Western Hemisphere. Instead of acquiring vaccines from abroad, the government had devoted resources developing Cuba's own vaccines. But then the government lacked funds to buy enough syringes to administer its vaccines. Moreover, the decline in foreign currency earnings resulted in significant shortage of basic necessities, such as chicken, eggs, rice, beans, and even hygienic products such as soap and toothpaste. Inflation was soaring by mid-2021. These circumstances coincided with President Trump's decision to roll back most of President Obama's executive orders that had relaxed US sanctions. New regulations reduced the amount of remittances Cuban Americans could send to their families and later forced the closure of Western Union's operations in Cuba. which had been the principal conduit for remittances. Trump restrictions also reduced by more than half the number of US visitors to Cuba prior to the onset of the pandemic. In a final blow in early 2021, the Trump State Department returned Cuba to its list of state sponsors of terrorism, which further hampered Cuba's ability to engage in international financial transactions. Despite promises during the 2020 presidential campaign, President Biden has not reversed any of the Trump administration's actions. Meanwhile, so-called influencers in Florida, funded in part by conservative exiles, gained force from the Cubans' newfound access to the internet. In addition, the United States stepped up its efforts to instigate protests and disruptions. These projects continue today, well into the Biden administration. Under circumstances where Cuba was not struggling with multiple challenges, external support for internal opponents might have had little impact. But in the context of a perfect storm, the annual $20 million US democracy promotion programs undoubtedly contributed to the level of protests. In this brief summary, I've tried to provide you with the context for the July 11th protests. Our panel will provide more detail about the situation in Cuba today and consider what might lie ahead. We'll start with Hope Bastian. Hope received her PhD in anthropology from American University, and she is an assistant professor at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. She recently returned from living in Cuba for the last 10 years while doing field research and teaching at the University of Havana. She is the author of Everyday Adjustments in Havana, Economic Reforms, Mobility, and Emerging Inequalities. William LeoGrande is professor of government and emeritus dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University. Included among his large number of published works about Cuba are Cuba at the Crossroads, which he co-edited, and Back Channel to Cuba, the history of negotiations between Washington and Havana, which he co-authored. John Kirk is emeritus professor of Latin American Studies at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada. Included among his long list of publications on Cuba are Healthcare Without Borders, Understanding Cuban Medical Internationalism, which he authored, and Cuba at the Crossroads, which he co-edited. We anticipate that there will be many questions following the presentations. Please write your questions succinctly in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. The question and answer session will be moderated by Maria Carla. I turn now to Hope Bastian.
Hi. So when I left Havana this summer, the economy had taken another dive. We had a brief recovery from the previous summer's crisis, which was known on the island as the coyuntura. So after a decade of living in Cuba as an anthropologist, studying inequalities and their impacts on everyday life, it was clear that although salaries and pensions increased in late 2020, they're no match for the rampant inflation and an unraveling safety net. The impacts of domestic economic policies on household economies have been severe. The MLC appeared and quickly mutated to replace the CUC and became central to basic health and the temporary price of. And for mothers across the city who I'm working is dependent who tries out. And of course, closed a friend, a mother of two, and a computer programmer. Get down for me. It began repeating itself. Cuba in today in 2021. The policies that were implemented to control the spread of COVID have required great sacrifice and great commitment from the population. And as the pandemic fatigue has set in, their political costs have been high, and that's become more clear. So when new leaders like President Díaz-Canel ask for sacrifice, the response is not the same as it was in Cuba in the 1990s. Cuba as a country and the revolution as a social political project made it through the special period because of the sacrifices of the people. Every Cuban who stayed and kept on keeping on, as well as those who left, whether in rafts or with visas, and sent money back to support their families that they left behind, had a big role to play. But today, no one wants to go back to the special period. Young people say they've not seen the benefits of their parents' and their grandparents' sacrifices. And it was actually a new promise to change what needs to be changed that's kept them on the island. And they expect Díaz-Canel to deliver on that promise. So despite all of these pressures, there's an ethos in Cuba that supports resiliency, right? El cubano se ríe hasta de su propia desgracia. People laugh instead of crying. And it's one of the ways that growing internet access has affected social life in Cuba. It's given new outlets to do this. And as the number of Cuban users increase, Facebook and social media have been important spaces for catharsis, to marvel at the absurdities of bureaucracy, to share everyday frustrations, to complain about things that don't work, and sometimes with the hope that someone will read it and help, but sometimes also just to let off steam and to receive sympathy and solidarity from peers. Cuban humor and satire are alive and well, and everyday new memes and stickers on WhatsApp or Telegram circulate critiques that are created on the island that have become a part of everyday life and political debates. And people can tell the difference between jokes made in Cuba and those coming from abroad, because the ones that are coming from abroad just aren't as funny. If the opening of Wi-Fi parks in 2015 changed how Cubans on the island communicated with the world, when data services became available in 2018 on cell phones, it changed the way that Cubans communicated with their friends across town, down the street, through WhatsApp and Messenger and Facebook and Telegram, in a country where a lot of people don't even have landlines at home. So the number of internet users has grown quickly. By February 2019, 40% of cell phone users were actively using data. By March 2021, more than 5 million Cubans were online, and 4 million were connecting from their cell phones. So especially for the group that I call connected Cubans, who may have access to the internet through their workplaces or pay for data to work in the international gig economy, relationships are being maintained online. And long before July 11th, a generation that was often disconnected from traditional spaces of political participation, like the CDRs, the FNC, or other mass organizations, was already creating new spaces of sociability and mobilizing their peers both on and off the island around common concerns, organizing to address social problems. During the pandemic, this connectivity has meant access to information about where to find basic food in the chronically understocked stores in the city. It's created new ways to put food on the table. You can order food from state stores and even on the black market to get delivered to your home. You can skip the lines. Some people are able to stay safe at home. And WhatsApp delivery businesses have also emerged where products that are missing from the agros are available at a premium. So while connected Cubans have used social media and social networks to meet their own needs, food for the body and for the soul, during the COVID pandemic, this new connectivity has also made it possible to engage in activism in new ways. They're using their megas, their megabytes, to help others. Digital infrastructures have been harnessed by these Cuban internet users as early as fall of 2018 to coordinate grassroots actions in Havana around issues as diverse as same-sex marriage, disaster recovery, and animal rights. So if we go back to the freak tornado that hit Havana in January of 2019, the internet access proved essential for spontaneous civil society organizing that connected Cubans on and off the island. They collected donations, they organized work brigades, they announced collection sites through Facebook and pickup spots to shuttle volunteers into the area. And they pounded the pavement and they wrote down the needs of affected households. They created Google Maps and Docs, collaborative maps of the affected area, and posted pictures and testimonies of their visits. And they were able to confirm the delivery of aid. These reassurances helped keep donations flowing from Cubans abroad who wanted to see that their aid was going directly to the people being affected. In April of 2019, hundreds of people marched through Vedado in a procession against animal cruelty that was organized through Facebook. One of the directors of a Cuban digital pet magazine was granted permission by the Municipal Consejo de Administración in Plaza to hold a procession right through the middle of Vedado to the Colón Cemetery. And it was the first time in decades that an organized non-state sector actors received a permit for a march on Havana streets. In February 2021, the group was successful and securing the passage of a new animal welfare law. And Archipelago has followed this group's example in attempting to secure permits for nationwide marches on November 15th. So we go back even further to mid-2018 when the constitutional Article 68 was proposed, which would have allowed same-sex marriage in Cuba. And LGBTQ Facebook users and their allies have been using social media to fight back against the intrusion of fundamentalist churches in political life through campaigns like Acepto, 68 Va, Abriendo Brechas de Colores, 11M, Yo Apoyo Matrimonio Igualitario in Cuba, and groups like Ahora Sí. So in May of 2019, a little later in the same year, the LGBT community was still hurting from the removal of Article 68 from the final constitution, when the Ministry of Public Health canceled the yearly conga parade for the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia. And someone posted on Facebook that they should march anyways, and they did. It went viral. And that Saturday, hundreds of people gathered in Central Park in Havana for a celebratory walk down the Paseo del Prado. In the last year, these campaigns, online LGBTQ campaigns, have continued to build momentum to educate the public about the need for an inclusive families code that guarantees equal rights for all, including same-sex families. So the increased reach of the internet and social media is creating new spaces of debate and activism, strengthening ties between young Cubans who've stayed in Cuba and peers abroad who maintain their residency and continue to participate in the digital sphere as if they never left. After years of state discourses criticizing the revolution's own paternalism and the population for passively waiting for the state to fix problems, connected Cubans are taking measures into their own hands. And as these groups begin to have impacts in the real world, there's a growing sense of awareness of collective efficacy. So these campaigns provided young Cubans with experience in organizing and an infrastructure that made it possible for networks to rapidly reactivate in the summer of 2021 in response to the declining health situation in Remittances. And they were able to put together the pieces as well to understand what was going on in the country after the immediate aftermath of the protests of July 11th, despite the internet blackouts. So later, many of the same connected Cubans used digital infrastructures to aid and support protesters who had been detained. So of course, the expansion of access to the internet has given connected Cubans access to information, the ability to read foreign newspapers or articles and analysis published in new independent media. But this group is also known to post their own long essays and analysis directly on their Facebook walls, where it's shared and where it's debated. It's not all cat pictures on the Cuban Facebook world. Okay, so recent changes in political processes on the island and the role of emerging conservative Christian pressure groups in policymaking has contributed to a perception that the state has ceded power to fundamentalist sects and brought about a crisis of legitimacy among progressive Cubans who identify with the revolution's historical commitment to social justice, who question why the right to dissent is only respected when religiously based. Connected Cubans' access to new media has both broken the media monopoly and changed the news cycle. Because of the lag time, today, the evening news in Cuba no longer simply reports. It must attempt to reframe debates that are already underway in the Cuban virtual public sphere. State media is left to comment on what is already known and attempt to contextualize or debunk information coming from other sources. So set on the offensive, their reframing often seems to draw on discourses that can alienate some of the more connected and critical viewers. So the state has responded to this diversity of opinions and critiques in social media by issuing new decrees, like the Law Decree 35 of August of 2021, which expanded previous practices and limits of expression to digital spaces and new technologies. The announcement of Law Decree 35 has led to a boom in false profiles on Facebook, Twitter, and other social networks as connected Cubans decline to give up the spaces for expression and debate that they've created. Instead, they're choosing to go anonymous and protect themselves from the new restrictions. So Cubans will continue to debate online, and
Hope
despite
in
any
2 more
restriction.
minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So Cubans are continuing to debate online, despite restrictions that might be imposed by the state. And Facebook and social media have been important spaces for organizing actions and for catharsis. That's all.
Thanks very much. Very good analysis. We turn now to William LeoGrande.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks to everyone who has joined us this evening. The protests that broke out on July 11 attracted enormous attention abroad because they were so unusual and so unexpected. As Phil said at the outset, there's nothing like this in really the history of the Cuban Revolution all the way back to 1959. There was more people participating in these demonstrations, and they had a wider scope by far than the demonstrations on the Malecón in 1994 during the special period. Thousands of people turned out across several dozen towns and cities on July 11. And the demonstrations were also unusually violent. I mean, a lot of the demonstrations were at least began as peaceful demonstrations and spontaneous ones, but there was excessive use of force by some of the police, and there was also considerable violence by some of the protesters and looting of stores. So as Phil indicated, and Hope gave you some of the feel for it, these protests were really sparked by the hardships, the economic hardships that Cubans have been facing over the last year. Shortages of food and medicine, electrical blackouts, which are particularly hard on people because people stand in line for hours or travel trying to find food. They put it in their refrigerators and the electricity goes out and it spoils. The inflation that has come out of the currency unification that began on January 1st has far outstripped what the government expected. The government increased salaries, state sector salaries, in order to try to balance off the increase in prices that came from the currency unification. But inflation has already eaten up all of those increases and more. And so people's real income has actually declined this year. And then, of course, you have the surge in COVID, which began in the spring and really peaked over the summer, and particularly in the province of Remittances, where a lot of the most violent demonstrations happened. But these demonstrations were not only economic. They also had a political message. If any of you have seen some of the videos of them, people are chanting political slogans. I think the demonstrations are a signal to the government of the political challenges that it faces. And I think these demonstrations came at a time when the government is facing a greater degree of political vulnerability than it has in the past. In April, at the 8th Congress of the Cuban Communist Party, Raul Castro and all the remaining historical leaders of the revolution retired and stepped down from their positions, handing off power completely to a generation of leaders born after 1959. In the population, there's also a serious generational divide between the generations, the older generations now, who experienced the revolution's early years, and younger generations who have only experienced the hardships that Cuba has endured since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And for more on this issue of generational change, I encourage people to read the article by Harold Cardenas in the symposium that we edited. It's also clear that state organizations have not been as responsive to people's needs as they need to be. And that's particularly been true in marginal communities. Several years ago, Cuban filmmakers went around to marginal neighborhoods with Silvio Rodriguez, a Cuban singer who was giving concerts in those communities. But the film is not really about the concerts. The film is really about the quality of life in those marginal communities. And it's a devastating film because it shows just how difficult life is. And more importantly, the extent to which state organizations have not been responsive to the needs of people in those communities. That film was not shown publicly in Cuba from the time it was made until just after the July demonstrations. And then it was shown on Cuban TV, which I think signals that the Cuban leadership recognizes that this is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And finally, as Hope was describing in detail, increased internet access has allowed people to organize virtual social networks, including social networks of people who are dissidents. And those networks are really outside of government control. So the government's response to the July demonstrations and to the new demonstrations that are planned for November 15th has really had two different dimensions to it, if you will. First, the government has vigorously denounced these demonstrations as part of US efforts at subversion and has threatened participants in the November demonstration with prosecution. Hundreds, somewhere between 500 and 600, I think is the best estimate, of people were arrested during the July demonstrations, some of which are charged with engaging in acts of violence, but some apparently also just simply being charged with disorderly conduct for participating in the demonstrations. So the first response, the first element of the government's response has been to crack down on these demonstrations that are perceived as being counter-revolutionary. The second dimension has been to try to begin to address some of the social problems in the marginal communities that gave rise to demonstrations in July. And so the government has created groups of experts, has promised new resources to go into these communities to address the problems of infrastructure deterioration and poor services. I think it remains to be seen whether the government will make a sustained effort in this regard and provide local government with the resources that they really need to begin to address these problems. I do want to say a little bit about US policy. I think the impact of the July demonstrations on US policy was to freeze Donald Trump's sanctions in place. As many of you on this call know, President Biden had promised to restore remittances, restore travel, restaff the US embassy, and re-engage the Cuban government in diplomatic dialogue. For the first 6 months of his administration, he did nothing because Cuba was not a priority. After the protests, I think any move to relax sanctions now would be attacked by Republicans as rescuing the Cuban government from imminent collapse, which of course is what they accused President Obama of when he announced his policy of engagement back in 2014. So the events on the ground in Cuba have raised the political cost for Biden to lift the sanctions that Donald Trump imposed and frozen the policy in place. Biden, of course, also has imposed new sanctions, targeted sanctions against individuals and groups of individuals in Cuba, accusing them of human rights violations on July 11. These are sanctions that really have no practical effect on Cubans other than to further poison the atmosphere of bilateral relations. So I think Biden was already reluctant before July 11 to do anything positive on Cuba because of domestic politics. Of course, domestic politics has always been an important determinant of US policy towards Cuba. Those of you who follow American politics know the Democrats lost badly in Florida in 2020 and are worried about what will happen in Florida in 2022, the midterm elections. And of course, Senator Robert Menendez is a very powerful senator, not only because he's vote number 50 for anything that the Democrats want to do, but because he's the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and therefore has power over every foreign policy nomination Biden wants to make and every foreign policy initiative Biden wants to take. July 11 also revived the pipe dreams among some people that the Cuban government may really be vulnerable to being overthrown if US sanctions are kept in place. I think most people who follow Cuban politics closely think that that is a severe misreading of the situation on the ground. But hope springs eternal among US policymakers that somehow just around the corner, the collapse of the Cuban government will happen if we just keep putting the pressure on. So at the moment, the administration is waiting to see what will happen on November 15th, see what those demonstrations will be like. Will they be small and relatively insignificant politically? Will they be massive and suggest that the Cuban government is in real political trouble? Will there be violence or not? The administration is not going to take any action at all on Cuba before they see what happens in November. And frankly, I doubt that they're going to take any action for the rest of this year. At the very best, they might possibly take action sometime early next year on some limited humanitarian issues, particularly the restoration of remittances. But it's also possible that they will do absolutely nothing until after the midterm elections in 2022. Meanwhile, the sanctions that are in place, left over from the Trump administration, are taking a terrible humanitarian toll on the Cuban people. Every time President Biden talks about Cuba, he says, I quote, he stands with the Cuban people, unquote. The reality is that after promising to relieve the suffering caused by Trump sanctions, Biden is really standing by doing nothing while that suffering continues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bill. That's remarkable territory that you covered in just a span of just a few minutes. Thank you. We turn now to John Kirk.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you to everybody who's tuning into this, I think, very timely discussion. I have two roles to fill, two files to deal with. The first one is the international reaction to the events of 11th of July. And secondly, to look at what has changed in Cuba since, what the Cuban government has done and how things are at the moment in Cuba. So I'll try and make a seamless transition from one to the other, but obviously there'll be bumps along the way. In terms of the international reaction, I think it's fair to say that most countries did not follow the initiative which Washington wanted them to take, that is to support them. The clarion call for freedom, as the president referred to, fell on deaf ears in many places. Many governments around the world condemned the heavy-handed repression of the Cuban security forces and made it very clear that their governments refused to accept this. They demanded that protesters be released. Typical was the European Union, and it noted that protests reflected legitimate grievances in the population about the lack of food, medicines, water, and power, as well as the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press. This declaration of the European Union, I think, was followed by several other governments. The Canadian government, I live in Canada, and I followed with interest the Canadian government. It adopted a very similar position, expressing, and I quote, deep concern over the violent crackdown on protests in Cuba, particularly the repressive measures against peaceful protesters, journalists and activists, and arbitrary detention, unquote. On the one hand, both Canada and the European Union condemned the abuses of the Cuban security forces, but at the same time, they opted not to accept the US policy towards Cuba. This was a position that was held almost universally by the world, with a few exceptions, as you'll see. Washington issued a statement on July the 25th, quote, the joint statement on Cuba. These countries who rejected the Biden administration's call for support were traditional allies like Canada, France, Germany, UK, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. It's important to note that only 20 countries supported the US initiative on this joint statement on Cuba. And I think that speaks volumes. So while the population of, while most countries rejected and condemned the abuse by security forces, the excessive use of force, at the same time, they understood the international context and were particularly displeased with what the US has been doing in Cuba. Washington's great ally, the Organization of American States, also tried to come to the support of the Biden administration. An emergency meeting was called by the Uruguayan ambassador to the OAS, but CARICOM, the Caribbean nations, rejected it, and 13 Caribbean countries stood up and said, no, there's no time to hold this meeting, we will reject it. The views were expressed well by Sir Ronald Sanders, who was the ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda, and also the coordinator of the CARICOM group. And he said, and I think this is very important, any discussion can only satisfy political hawks with an eye on the US midterm elections, where winning South Florida with the backing of Cuban exiles would be a prize. The task of the OAS should be to promote peaceful and cooperative relations in the hemisphere, not to feed division and conflict. So the initiative, the démarche to try to get the OAS to support the Biden administration failed. The joint statement failed. Only 20 countries supported Washington. Very surprising was the outspoken position taken by Mexican President AMLO, López Obrador, who condemned the US embargo and provided substantial material for Cuba. 3 ships, food, medicines, and oil all came from Mexico. And when he referred to the US policy on Cuba, he didn't hold back. He referred, and I quote, to the US embargo as, quote, an extreme measure, inhumane, a medieval act. Strong words from the single largest trading partner of the United States. He also slammed the OAS, calling the need to replace it with, quote, an organization that is truly autonomous and not a lackey of any nation, unquote. Not surprising was the support that came from traditional allies of Cuba, and Russia and China, Vietnam, even North Korea provided support. North Koreans gave verbal support, but the others gave a fair amount of physical support as well as political support. The Chinese government sent 3 large donations of medical supplies and condemned US policy on Cuba. The spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and I quote, China firmly opposes any move to arbitrarily impose unilateral sanctions and interfere in other countries' internal affairs under the pretext of so-called freedom, human rights, democracy. We urge the US to stop making excuses to engage in gross interference and destabilization, unquote. Not surprising. President Xi Jinping, in a telephone conversation with President Diaz-Canel, talked about relations with Cuba as being, quote, a model of solidarity and cooperation. China is ready to intensify high-level exchanges with Cuba, strengthen the exchanges and mutual learning in the governance of party and state, unquote. So we have the Russians rushing to support Cuba. We have the Chinese doing the same thing. President Putin spoke with his counterpart. An official Kremlin account of the conversation noted, quote, the strategic nature of Russian-Cuban partnership that is rooted in old traditions of friendship and mutual support will continue. So my conclusion is that there was indeed international concern at the conduct of Cuban security forces. That said, the US strategy of trying to isolate Cuba failed disastrously. It did manage to obtain the support for its July 25th joint statement on Cuba from 20 countries, including 5 Latin American countries. As Latin Americanists, you will know the human rights situation in these countries: Brazil, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia. I think not much more needs to be said. Washington continues to have a policy of selective indignation in how it perceives human rights abuses in the hemisphere. Among the 20 countries, in addition to the 5 Latin American countries, the other supporters included Croatia, Cyprus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kosovo, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. Not exactly major players on the international scene. But it was strongly opposed by its major trading partner, Mexico, and was unable to garner support for its traditional ally, the OAS. Bilateral relations between Cuba and allies China and Russia, traditional ideological foes of Washington, were strengthened, since all have strong interests, strategic interests in such a union. Such ties can only damage Washington's interests. Really, it was not all that surprising to see the status quo result in the international reaction to the events of the 11th of July. Many countries are aware of the long-standing US interests in bringing about regime change in Cuba. And were understandably displeased with the Cuban government's reaction to the protest, but at the same time were displeased with Washington's goals. Most realized that Washington's goals were not selfless, but they reflected domestic political ambitions. In many ways, this international reaction mirrored a vote which had taken place just a few months earlier at the US General Assembly, when 184 countries had condemned the US embargo, with only 2, the US and Israel, supporting it and 3 abstaining, Brazil, Colombia, and the Ukraine. My paper in the virtual book, which Phil referred to, ends by citing the Mexican president with some sage advice for the Biden administration. It's time to end the US embargo, he said, almost universally condemned for the 29th time at the UN General Assembly, and also to allow family remittances to Cuba. Hostility with Cuba has not worked and will not work. The resilience that Hope referred to, I think, is very profoundly rooted. In the words of AMLO, it is time for a new path, and I quote, something which is of fundamental importance, dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. Switching now, if Phil will allow me to make my seamless transition, what has happened in Cuba since, what the Cuban government has done since July the 11th, and what's happened in society. It was unprecedented, as we've seen. Nothing like it since the Malconazo in 1994, which paled in comparison, has ever happened. It was very clear that the Cuban government had misread the political tea leaves in terms of the level of frustration and had to act quickly. The contributors of our forum illustrate clearly the reasons for popular frustration. There are some fantastic essays written in this virtual book. Strongly advise you to look at it. It's accessible, and I think it is first rate. I feel so proud at having participated in it. What's the government done? Well, the government clearly is listening and is concerned. It had to be. President Díaz-Canel on November the 5th, this year said, and I quote, "No podemos seguir haciendo las cosas de igual forma si han demostrado que no funcionan. Necesitamos cambiar modos de hacer en cuestiones como la producción de alimentos, la diversificación en la tierra." So it's clear that President Díaz-Canel gets the big picture. So what exactly has happened? Well, I would argue that a tremendous amount has happened since July the 11th. The list of investment opportunities at the International Business Forum, November the 29th to December the 2nd, coming up, organized by the Ministry of Foreign Trade. There are 503 opportunities for foreign investors indicated, including Cubans living abroad, and also including the new micro, small, and medium-sized businesses in Cuba. Never before seen. I think that's important. In terms of reforms to allow Cubans to work independently, there are more than 16,000 cuenta propia projects have been registered by November the 3rd. An opening of the floodgates of free enterprise, of people wanting to work for themselves. 69% of these are new. The rest have been modified. Most are in accommodation, food, manufacturing, and agriculture. By mid-October, 162 micro, small, and medium enterprises have been established. Quite extraordinary. In total, 416 requests have been approved since September, which will generate approximately 6,000 jobs. Food production is a major problem in Cuba. Cuba, as we know, imports about 70% of its food. The basic problem, production incentives are too low. One of the things which the government has done, which I think is very important and needs to be imitated, emulated, the price of milk to farmers has increased, giving greater benefits to the people working in that sector.
John, you have 2 minutes.
Thanks, Phil. I'll finish by in 2 minutes. Credits in hard currency have been given to cooperatives and to the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Again, this had not happened before. People have been calling for this for years. If you look at some of the excellent economists at the University of Havana, they've been calling for this for years, and the government has not been listening. Now the government is listening because it has no alternative. In terms of social service innovations, a major challenge to which Bill referred. Even President Diaz-Canel on July the 14th noted, quote, the needs of some protesters were not adequately met. They are legitimately dissatisfied. There have been fractures in our attention to certain social problems in disadvantaged or vulnerable neighborhoods, unquote. The university system, the Universidad Popular José Martí, which used to exist in the 1920s, has been revived for sectores populares y obreros. Most importantly, and Bill referred to this briefly, there are 62 barrios in Havana, and scores more outside the capital are now being attended to in terms of improving housing, infrastructure, services, trying to prevent social problems, and particularly creating work opportunities for young people and for women. There are also symbolic reopenings in this nueva normalidad, which is starting to set out. Cinemas have been reopened in 11 provinces. School restarted this week. So on the 15th, there will be the last tranche of students who will be going back. The international tourism opens big time on November the 15th. There are no need for tests for people arriving at the airport, only vacation certificates. The Cuban population has now, I think 73% have been vaccinated completely. So
if you could wrap up.
Wrap up. Electrical services have improved, bus, rail have improved, medical oxygen is now back to normal. Culturally, the Canción de Barrio that Bill referred to 7 years after it was shown at the National Film Festival is now was shown on Cuban TV. In sum, there have been significant changes made since July the 11th. Many had been requested for years. There are two pertinent questions I leave you with. Why did it take so long for anything to be done about these needs? The second one is more pertinent. Has the government done enough to bring about a lasting new reality? Thank you, Mr. Timekeeper.
Thank you, John. You managed to bring together those two things very well. I turn now to Maria Carla, who will take questions and direct them to our speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we move on to the Q&A, I wanted to thank our speakers for being here today to talk about July 11th and the situation in Cuba. July 11th is a date that marked a before and after and signal what we have been observing for a while, that Cuba is not monolithic, and that when analyzing the Cuban context, we have to take into account the diversity of the current civil society. It has been mentioned, but I can't emphasize enough how dire the humanitarian situations on the island is, and how urgent it is that we find ways to constructively help and support the Cuban people. And to this end, representatives Jim McGovern, Barbara Lee, Gregory Meeks, and Bobby Rush are circulating a Dear Colleague letter to President Biden regarding change in US policy towards Cuba to address the humanitarian and economic crisis and to restore engagement. So we need you all to get in touch with your representative and urge them to sign onto the letter now. The deadline for sign-ons is Friday, November 19th, and I'm going to drop in the chat the link to our call for action, where you can find how to contact a representative and a sample script to use or adapt in case you need it. Now moving on to our questions. The first one is for Hope. To what is the extent of internet and data access today? How vulnerable are Cubans to a government shutdown of online communications in the upcoming week?
So that's a great question. There's a joke in Cuba recently that when your internet's not working on your phone, the immediate response is, oh, I wonder what's happening, right? So there must be a protest somewhere or something's going on, right? And I think that joke, it tells us about a social reality, right? So of course, it's a great question to say, okay, well, the last time there were these protests, the response was by cutting off internet access, and it could very well happen again. It would not be surprising to anyone if it did. One thing that is that I find interesting is actually November 15th in Cuba has been announced that there will be a tuitazo. So it's the government-sponsored kind of campaign for people to tweet about the anniversary of the Revista Mujeres, which is the magazine of the Federation of Cuban Women. So in the past, when there have been these kind of state-sponsored tuitazo events, internet access has been made available in public spaces, like at the university, and people have been encouraged to tweet. So there have been tuitazos against the embargo. And so just the fact that this tuitazo has been announced for November 15th, that the state is encouraging people on that date to tweet about the anniversary of the Revista Mujeres makes me wonder, perhaps they will not, perhaps the plan is not to cut off communications on that day, but we will see.
Thank you, Hope. Now, a question for you, Bill. The Biden administration insists that an alternative mechanism is required for remittances, and they have sent back the recommendations from the working group. What can you share with us about how remittances work?
So remittances that are being sent by wire to Cuba, most of them are coming from the United States. They have to go to some Cuban financial institution. And the Biden administration is saying, well, the Cuban government mustn't gain any money from these transfers. Well, there are costs obviously involved, even if it's only a few percentages cost of conducting these transactions. I mean, if you send money to Cuba via Western Union, as you used to be able to do before Donald Trump cut that off, you had to pay 3, 4, or 5% of the value of the remittances that you were sending. And then Western Union would have to pay a proportion of that to the receiving institution in Cuba. There are a lot of different ways that money could be sent so that it didn't necessarily go to financial institutions that are directly managed by the conglomerate that the armed forces manages. But at the end of the day, any remittance that gets wired to Cuba is going to have to go to a Cuban financial institution. And since there are not any private banks in Cuba, there is no way of avoiding the Cuban government getting at least a small percentage of that money. And if the money is going to go to the MLC debit cards that Cubans spend in state stores, the hard currency cards, then obviously the government is going to capture those, at least a profit off of those transactions. So in part, I think that the administration is using this as an excuse not to lift the limit on remittances, because they're setting a bar which is so unachievable that the Cuban government receive no money from remittances, that they'll never find a mechanism that will actually accomplish that.
Thank you, Bill. A question for you, John. You mentioned the UN General Assembly resolution condemning the embargo. Do you think the UN will ever follow through on this? And does the US veto that it holds as a permanent member of the Security Council play any role in the fact that so far no concrete action has been taken?
I think it's pretty clear that the entire universe, with the exception of Israel and the United States, would like common sense to be introduced into US policy towards Cuba. I think that it is more a symbolic gesture than anything with teeth. But it's very clear that in every declaration the United States has made about Cuba, there are very few countries that support it. The exploitation of domestic politics of Cuba for domestic politics is appalling. The selective indignation in terms of human rights abuses is unacceptable. So I think that the UN depends upon the United States and will continue to depend upon the United States. At the same time, it is very frustrated, and the number of 29 years the United States General Assembly has condemned the embargo and will continue. It's time for common sense to be implemented in US policy towards the island.
Thank you, John. Back to you, Hope. If internet and has been used as a vector for political organizing, but also to resolve day-to-day needs, how do you understand the framing on the part of the Cuban authorities of activists as simply vehicles of US interest? And do you think many Cubans believe so?
No, that's a great question. I think that yeah, it's that the internet is only a space for political action, right? Because there's lots of things going on WhatsApp. I mean, there's breastfeeding support groups. There's groups of high school friends making jokes and sending memes, and a lot of those things aren't being done with any sort of political goals that are bigger than that. So it's very diverse, the ways in which people are using these new forms of media.
Okay, there have been several questions regarding the upcoming November 15th, so I'm going to try to group them and then open it to anyone who wants to answer. The protests were not permitted by the government, and are we likely to see a repeat of the July 11th protest, a repeat of violence? Was it US generated, as the Cuban government keeps stating? And how much of the financial, material, and ideological support comes to Archipelago comes from the US government or for people in the US? And how should these factors influence our views on the protest? And what political scenarios do you see coming down the road?
I'll start, and let me say, I don't think that November 15th is going to be a repeat of July 11th for a number of reasons. July 11th, as I said at the outset, was really a kind of an outburst, an expression of people's frustration at the bad economic situation, at the surge in COVID, and it was largely spontaneous. It's true that some of the demonstrations were organized initially by dissidents, but they expanded dramatically as people spontaneously came out of their houses and joined in. And that meant that the crowds that on July 11 didn't have an agreed upon political program. They didn't have a commonality of interests other than the fact that they were just angry with the government about the state of affairs. November 15 has a specific political program. It's broad, it's vague, but and it's also organized by and seems to be aimed at middle-class intellectuals. And so I think that's who will turn out by and large, which means I expect a much smaller crowd on November 15th than we saw on July 11. The other difference, of course, is that the government was taken completely by surprise on July 11. And this time they've had a lot of time to prepare for these demonstrations. So they're doing their best to minimize the participation by declaring it illegal, by branding it as a project of the United States, by branding the organizers as counter-revolutionaries, by threatening to arrest people who participate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the demonstrations are likely to be relatively small. We will see how the government responds. I understand that Foreign Minister Rodriguez in his press conference today said that the demonstrations will not be allowed to take place. I don't know what that means exactly. I think we just will have to wait and see.
I had two thoughts I'd like to share. First of all, I agree with Bill that I don't think that we will see a reprisal. It's the time of the 502nd anniversary of the founding of the city of Havana. Tourism is reopening. The COVID levels are down, 413 cases today as opposed to 10,000 in July. There are changes underway in social and cultural matters. There's 6 short films have been made under the directorship of Fernando Perez about life in Cuba on COVID. So all of these things from the government side, I think that they're aiming to try to bring about as normal a reality as possible. And if you look at the Facebook page of Archipelago, you will see likewise, they have toned down what their expectations are. They're encouraging people to be quiet, to be calm, to wear white, not to cause trouble. So I think that both sides are going through the motions, and I think that they intend to keep things as under control as possible. The second point I'd like to make is that I think just as important as what happens in the island is what happens internationally. And I think that I get the impression that Archipelago has realized that they've lost this particular round. But what they can do to try to influence governments around the world is to try to have demonstrations throughout the world, small groups of exiles protesting in various cities around the world. So I think that just as important as what happens on the island is what happens outside. I expect a limp response relatively compared to what we saw on the 11th of July, but looking for media coverage internationally. And we all know that the media coverage will be negative if there are any the slightest examples of abuse of human rights. So I think that is important to bear in mind and to be prepared for, because I think that is the strategy which will be implemented.
Thank you, John. Another question for you, Bill. Jake Sullivan, citing 7-Eleven, said on Sunday that circumstances have changed in Cuba and that it was a reason for the administration to reassess the policy review that it said it was conducting. Do you agree with this analysis and agree with his policy response?
Well, so some things have changed and some things have not changed. Two of the things that changed as a result of July 11 is that the political cost to the domestic political cost to Biden of doing anything positive on Cuba has gone up. And so that reduces the chance that they will do anything positive. And the other thing is that their hope that maybe regime change really is just around the corner has gone up as well. And that also suggests they won't do anything positive. Two things that haven't changed, though, are US interests in having a normal relationship with Cuba, and the abject failure for 62 years of the policy of sanctions that the Biden administration seems to have fallen back into without actually making a conscious decision about it. So, the policy of basically doing nothing, which is what the Biden administration has decided on, just leaves in place these sanctions that Biden himself denounced during the campaign as being cruel and unnecessary and against the interests of the United States. Now I'm sorry to say, I think that US policy is being driven by domestic politics on the one hand, and secondly, by this hope that maybe the Cuban government really will fall.
Thank you, Bill. Hope.
I'd like to say something about that too, Maria Carla. In the 1990s, President Clinton changed US policy to focus on US interests rather than to act reciprocally to whatever Cuba did. That makes a lot of sense, to focus on US interests. And in fact, that's what President Obama did as well. What's changed under President Biden, as you can hear from Jake Sullivan, from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, from Juan Gonzalez in the National Security Council, is that now we are once again playing the game of reciprocal actions, and it makes no sense for the United States to do that.
If I could kick in, it seems to me that the most recent statement that further sanctions by the United States will be used if repression continues. I'm not too sure what further sanctions can be used, but it seems to me, looking at this from Canada, as being incredibly arrogant. That if you continue to do this, we will introduce further sanctions. Get a life, back off. I find it quite offensive.
Thank you, John. A question for you, Hope. Movements like San Isidro and 27 and now Archipelago have seen increasing support among the youth and intellectual and artists. Is there a generational component to it? To what degree is the recent social movement in Cuba reflective of recent social outcries in other Latin American countries?
Wow, that's a huge question. Look at the impact of the internet and kind of new modes of communication on what's going on in Cuba. We are looking at kind of a younger demographic there, a younger generation, right? And I think one of the things that's really interesting is kind of there's not very many digital natives in Cuba, right? Even the millennials are kind of learning these new technologies, right? And younger generations are learning these new technologies too, right? And at the same time, the state is having to learn these new technologies, right? And how to use Twitter, how to use Facebook, how to use social media to get their message across, right? And how to listen to what's coming across the social media posts and debates that are going on. So I think it's really important to see what the state does with that, right? And whether they're able to respond to it. It's been amazing to me watching social media over the since the expansion of access to the internet, and to see how transparent people are, you know, in their social media accounts with their first name and last name connected to all of their friends. You know exactly who this person is. You don't have to do much something, and how honest people are about sharing their experiences and sharing their opinions, right? And the same way before social media, people would do, you know, hanging out at home or over Domino's on the corner, or you know, in a line at the bodega, right? But this is now happening online, right? And before the very recent Law Decree 35, which really penalized this anything that was really talking against the government or against the state, this was happening very openly, very transparently. And the response that has been actually to create a bunch of fake accounts. So a lot of these folks have their regular account where they used to have all these debates and to express their opinions. And now they have a fake account as well, right? And so they're strategic about which account they use to share which opinions, right? In order to protect themselves.
Thank you, Hope. Given Cuba's difficult economic situation, are there resources available to the Cuban government to respond to the needs of the marginal communities, or to address the broader complaints that helped drive the July 11th demonstrations? And are there other measures that the Cuban government could be taking to produce visible improvements in daily life, given the reality of US restrictions? This one's for you, Bill.
So the one thing I can think of that the Cuban government could do, because the shortage of foreign exchange currency it has right now is a result largely of external shocks. To be sure, part of it is the fact that the Cuban economy itself is not as productive as it could be, and therefore doesn't earn a lot of hard currency by exporting goods. And but the external shocks, the decline in oil shipments from Venezuela, the loss of tourism dollars from COVID, and the loss of remittances because of Trump sanctions, those are all things outside of the government's control. What the government can do is redirect the resources that it has from the uses that it's being put to now. And I would think one thing that could be done, if it isn't being done already, is to scaled back their plans for domestic investment in particularly the tourism sector, which I know they've been trying to expand, and put that money instead into investments in improving the infrastructure in some of these marginal communities. I think, you know, a small amount of money would actually go quite a long way in a number of these communities because the situation is so difficult. So if they're really committed to improving life conditions there, they're just going to have to find the money from other projects.
Yeah, I think the easy answer is no, the resources are not there, right?
Yeah.
Had the resources been there, we would be having a very different conversation, right? If there said was that that what the government has, in this article, they say that what the government hasn't realized after the protest on July 11th was the urgent need to create new mechanisms for popular participation, right? And so, you know, people haven't had ways to express their needs, right? And I said this generation now, this connected generation, this generation who stayed in Cuba during the Obama opening because they saw kind of a future for themselves on the island, they stayed because of the promise that was made of changing what needs to be changed, right? And so the July 11th protests are really, you know, a flag, a red flag that the Cuban government, depending on how they respond, you know, are they going to change the things that people are saying need to be changed? And if they do, then, you know, they will increase their legitimacy, they will increase their power. And if they don't, it'll be a very different path.
Yeah. One thing that I think needs to be changed is to look at and I think Bill referred to the fact that many of the people who will protest on the 15th are people in the middle class, white, largely cultural sector. Decree 349, which was introduced as a means of government control of cultural activities, is very heavy-handed. And I think it's very different from the San Isidro movement, but I think that the very first demonstration that took place outside the Ministry of Culture expressing concern at Decree 349 had a lot of legitimacy. And I think that that looking at social media, looking at cultural expression in Cuba in general, one of the things that needs to be addressed is cultural policy and how that can be amended. It's very difficult because it doesn't cost any money, but it's ideological. And I think that the Cuban government will find that very difficult to do, but I think needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I agree with the comments earlier in terms of what are the differences between what happened on July 11th and what could happen on November 15th. They're completely different protests, right? The July 11th was this spontaneous reaction to these pressures of you know, the base of Cuban society, the things that everyone was going through. You finally find chicken, you put it in your freezer, and the power goes out for 12 hours and it defrosts. Yeah. And November 15th is very different because, you know, this is something that was announced with, you know, a long time, and people had time to figure out who are these people, why are they calling this protest, does this align with my own political beliefs or my own interest, and so it's a very different decision to participate in those protests.
John, a quick question for you. You said that oxygen supplies in Cuba are back to normal. How did this happen? Seeing that U.S. sanctions have made such purchases and deliveries very difficult.
Maria Carla, can you repeat the first part of the question? What is back to normal?
Oxygen supplies.
Oh, yes. The Russian government provided a plant which was flown in. And the Cuban armed forces worked with them to get the oxygen back up and running. This was at a time when there was a major problem back in July and August with high numbers of COVID patients when the oxygen plant collapsed. And that's when the Russians came to the Cubans' assistance, and the FARC were able, with the Russians, to get it back up to normal. So now it is completely back up to normal, which I think is a great relief. Another thing that I'd like to mention in terms of normality, Venezuelan oil was gone from 40,000 barrels per day to 66,000 barrels a day, which I think is significant. So slowly things are starting to fall into place for the potential if the Cuban government has the political will and if the population agrees to go with the steps which the Cuban government will introduce.
Thank you, John. Going back to November 15th, how much have and if Junior and Archipelago associated themselves with the online dissident in Miami? Have they taken a position on U.S. restoration of remittances and travel, on the embargo or sanctions? To anyone that wants to answer.
So they've tried to be careful about associating themselves with some of the really old line Miami exile community on the far right, some of whom were engaged in terrorism against Cuba in the past. But at the same time, when asked, Junior Garcia has said, well, we want the support of all of the diaspora, of all Cubans who are abroad, sort of in effect dodging the question, if you will. I don't know that he has taken a position on the embargo, and I have not seen him taking a position against the embargo, but it's possible he has, and I have missed it. So if anybody else on the panel or in the audience for that matter knows the answer to that, please chime in, let us know.
I think it's interesting to note the conversation intercepted between him and what's the guy's name? The guy who wanted to arrange the flotilla from in Miami to come to give support. You must know who I'm talking about. He's the guy.
Ramon Sanchez.
Ramon Sanchez. And it was interesting because Junior clearly has a good working relationship with him, but at the same time was trying to keep a certain distance from what Mr. Sanchez was trying to do. Between that and the spy, the famous Fernando, and his discoveries, it's clear that the exile community is trying very hard to become involved. Archipelago, of its 34,000 members, it's unclear how many are living abroad, although a significant number are. So I think that's why I mentioned earlier that the international reaction, I think, will be lionized by the international media, precisely because I don't think that too much will be happening in terms of protest in Cuba itself.
If I can add, in an open letter to President Diaz-Canel, Archipelago did state that sanctions are hurtful for the Cuban people. So just to leave it out there. So moving on with other questions. Do you see anything positive coming out of this crisis situation, both in Cuba and in the US? Do you see any developments, for example, regarding the restaffing on the US Embassy or ongoing investigations into the so-called acoustic attacks?
Well, I don't, I mean, it's possible that the Biden administration may decide to restaff the embassy further. I mean, they've already expanded the number of officers in the embassy to some extent. But the key issue is really reopening the consular section so that Cubans don't have to travel outside the country to apply for a visa to travel to the United States. That's the key element. And they may do that in the foreseeable future. But in terms of anything positive in the bilateral relationship coming out of the current crisis, I'm sad to say, no, I don't see anything positive in the near to even medium term. On the island, the one thing that could come out of the crisis on the island that's positive is if the government really does begin to be more responsive to the needs of the community, and to do what Hope was talking about, which is to really create authentic means for ordinary Cubans to express their demands to the government, and have the government actually respond to those demands in ways that improve their standard of living.
Yeah, to follow up on that, one of the first things that President Raul Castro did when he began his term or his time in office were island-wide listening sessions, right? And they asked, what needs to be changed, and they wrote down what people said. And I think from what I've heard, for the first time, when they wrote down what people said, they didn't write down who said it. And that gave people a lot of freedom to speak their minds, right? But thanks to the technology, we don't have to. The Cuban state wouldn't have to have island-wide listening sessions to have an idea of what people are hoping to see in terms of changes. People are being very clear about the changes that they need to see, they want to see of this project of changing what needs to be changed. Of course, there's a lot of diverse opinions on what that is, right? And often people's idea of what needs to be changed and the state's idea of what they're planning on changing have not coincided.
Thank you, Hope. Another question for whoever wants to answer. Although there have been changes not seen before at the government level in Cuba, their handling of the protest has been awful. Do you think this is the time for the government to change their rhetoric, and wouldn't this be an opportunity to do so?
I think we will see on the 15th that the government has changed, has learned. This has been a wake-up call for the Cuban government, and I think that they realized that some of the abuses that took place, which if you compare, and I think people need to bear in mind what happened in Chile. 400 people lost their sight when the carabineros fired at the faces of protesters. Look at Colombia, look at Honduras. We have this selective indignation, and it bothers me that we look at the fact that one person was killed on July the 11th. I don't mean to whitewash the abuses that took place, and clearly Amnesty International reports were very good, but I think we need to see this in context, and I also think that the Cuban government will have learned from this. But let's not get too excited. Latin America is Latin America, and there are far worse protests which we tend to have forgotten about, which I think is unfortunate.
Thank you, John. We have a lot of questions left, but it's already 6:25, so I'm gonna pass the mic back to Phil to say our goodbyes, and thank you, everyone. Thank for attending and engaging with us today.
So thank you, Maria Carla. First, let me thank the panelists. You did a terrific job, both in presenting and answering questions. Thanks to our audience, very good questions. Let me remind the audience that in the chat box, there is a link to the symposium that this webinar was based on. And that landing page for the symposium has links also to films such as Canción del Barrio that were mentioned in the webinar. And WOLA has recorded this, and the WOLA channel on YouTube is available for that recording, will be available for that recording. For those of you who want to go back to it, for those of you who missed part of the talk. So thank you all very much. This was, I think we'll look forward to November 15th and try to get a sense of what the situation will be like for the future. And you've given us a great basis to do that. Thanks to everyone.